And then he goes on in Luke to say, Luke 5:37, and no man puts new wine into old bottles. Mark says, and no man puts new wine into old bottles. The same. No man, new wine into old bottles. Else the new wine from both does burst the bottles from Mark, or will burst the bottles. I definitely like will more. So Luke only will. Now back to both. Burst the bottles. Luke. And be spilled. And the wine is spilled. That's better. And from both. The wine from Mark only is from both now spilled. The wine is spilled. Mark says, and the bottles will be marred, but new wine must be put into new bottles. Luke says, and the bottles shall perish. And the bottles from both will be marred or shall perish. Will be marred. Marred, I always saw marred as damage, but not the same as something perishing. Perishing is totally done with. Damage you can survive, but if you're perished, that's it. So I think I want to go with that. Perish. Yeah, it's even underlined, and the note is be of no use, where marred is, okay, well here it says marred is ruined. But that's not really what marred means. Marred means like bad things have happened to it. It means damaged. Okay, perish explains it much more fully, and it's a more strong explanation of what's happening. So I'll say shall perish from Luke only. Those are better words. Shall perish. Although, if you want to look at this from a parable point of view, if it is what I was talking about, God's ways versus God's new ways, the old ways, are you saying God's old ways are perishing? I already know what a lot of people are going to say. God does not change. God's ways don't perish. Don't think he'd be talking about the people. The people aren't perishing just because there's a new way. But it's here in Luke, so I could choose it, and it should still work with the parable. I don't think I'd be ruining the parable if I choose the words Luke used instead of the words that Mark used. I'll stick with shall perish for the reasons that it's a stronger and more conclusive explanation of what's happening. Luke continues on, but new wine must be put into new bottles. Mark says, but new wine must be put into new bottles. The same. That's a new verse in Luke, isn't it? Yeah, it's a new verse after a period, whereas in Mark, it's a colon again, and then a lowercase b for the but. It's not, okay, it's still, I think that's a wrong use of the colon, so I'm going to go with Luke instead of Mark. But I'll still say that it's from both, because the word is from both. But new wine must be put into new bottles. Semicolon. And both are preserved. Oh, that's not even in Mark. So this is from, well, it ends in a period after bottles. After bottles, though, it's a semicolon in Luke. So now only yellow for the rest of the verse. And both are preserved. Okay, so how does that work into the parable? If this is God's way versus God's new way, keep them separate. Look at that. People disagree on what God says. Go your own ways. Follow God to the best of your ability, and we will follow God to the best of our ability too. Okay, I think this might be a good example of why there does need to be some separation between people, followers of God. I like the city church idea that every single believer of Jesus who follows Jehovah God ought to be a family and a community and work together to influence the city, to influence the whole world. I like that. And in fact, I joined what I believed was the beginnings of a city church, but almost immediately after I got there, there was a lot of issues. And there was another guy there who had been there for a long time. He was much older than me, and he was explaining to me that from the Psalms, he had gotten that there is a need and a call for a breach. That's what it was. I think that's the word he used. A breach. And even later on, the one guy who was calling for unity above all things, he even agreed that perhaps there is a need for, his explanation was actually pretty good, for the different parts of the body to be separate. Even though they're parts of the body, like your eyeballs and your stomach acid, they need to be separate, even though they're all parts of the body. So, look at that. Both are preserved, new wine in new bottles, old wine in old bottles. Works out. All for God's glory. And both are preserved. Now, the next verse. No man also having drunk old wine immediately desires new. Oh, look at that. There's just no words here. That's the end. It just goes right into him going through the cornfields in Mark. I wonder what it says in Matthew. Oh, it's not in Matthew. It talks about new cloth on an old garment. That which is put in will fill up, takes from the garment, the rent is made worse. Neither do you put new wine in old bottles. The bottles will break, the wine runs out, and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved. And that's the end, just like in Mark. It's going to read exactly the same. I don't know if there's going to be any difference, because as I'm reading through Matthew, that's pretty much what I had it look like, mixing Mark and Luke. It says perish instead of mar. It says both are preserved, like it does in Luke, which I know is from this first response instead of the second. Whatever. So all of this is now still Luke, then. No man also having drunk old italicized wine immediately desires new. And this is a colon in Luke. Look at that. I don't have a choice. I got to go with it. For he says the old is better. Oh, look at that. Jesus is talking about those who cling to the conservative ways. This is what we have. I can't help but think of my experience growing up in the Baptist church, how it was very traditional. You sing the old-fashioned hymns, none of the new songs. They have the old style, the 3 songs, the sermon, the benediction. All of that was very traditional. And I'm utterly convinced that God and our relationship with God has no restraint by tradition. That the typical ways of honoring God are not the only ways. You can't convince me of the fact that it has to be done the way it's always been done. No way. No way. I am an innovator, and I am eager to embrace whatever new thing God leads me to do. And of course, you have to test everything according to Scripture. Make sure that it is actually God that you're following and not yourself, not other people, not the world. But when you know God is telling you to do something, even if it's very different from how the church, traditional Christianity, or even your Christian friends believe that you ought to do, if you are following God, you follow God. And it might be new to everyone. Everyone might think it's strange and maybe even wrong. But test the spirits, test what you've heard, search the Scriptures, grow in your relationship with God, and however He leads you, follow. Then it continues in Mark and Luke. And no man puts new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles, and the wine be spilled, and the bottles shall perish. Matthew says it differently. Neither do men put new wine into old bottles. I think I like neither instead of and. They're both speaking about the same thing, so and would work. But both what was mentioned before and after are of what is not done. So I'm going to put neither instead of and. And I'll have to continue with neither do men put instead of no man puts. I'll have put all 3. I'll just have to... Well, I won't be able to identify that there's no S, that the S is taken off, but I think it's close enough. My attitude now is that the word is mostly there, and it's not a different tense. Puts, pretty much the same. So I do want to mention that word is in Mark and Luke. New wine into old bottles. Okay, the rest of that is all the same. Yeah, so it would hold the place. That word is similar, and it's right where the other words are in that sentence. New wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles. Else the bottles break.
Okay, so else the is all three now. New wine will burst the bottles. So bottles is all three. Bottles. Bottles break. And the wine. And the wine. Okay, so and is now all three. The wine is now Matthew as well as Mark. Runs out. Be spilled is more descriptive. Runs out. And the bottles perish. So, comma, and the bottles is all three. Perish. So shall is Luke. Perish is also Matthew. So this is orange. But new wine must be put into new bottles. Okay. But they put new wine into new bottles. So the word but is all three. But they put new wine. Okay, so new wine. They put new wine into new bottles. Must be put into new bottles. Okay, so new wine is all three. I'll explain in the addresses that the but and new wine are separated into new bottles. Is all three. And both are preserved. And both are preserved. So this is orange.